Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm here today with Stuart Skelly, who's one of our senior data protection consultants here at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider, Talk DP. So today, Stuart is going to be looking at the fines and enforcement action imposed by the Information Commissioner's Office in 2024. So just for a little bit of background, this is the third year Stuart's published an analysis on the ICO's monetary penalties that they've issued to enforce the GDPR and the PECR. And in previous years, Stuart was focusing a little bit more just on the fines and the monetary penalties rather than the other enforcement activities undertaken by the ICO. But this year he's gone a little bit more in depth in that he's considering the other forms of enforcement action, so reprimands and enforcement notices, just with that little bit more depth. So Stuart, given that added focus on reprimands and enforcement notices, can you give us a brief recap on the three types of enforcement action available to the regulator?
Yeah, sure, Annie. I think we're all clear on what a fine, sometimes called an administrative fine, because it's not a criminal sanction or a monetary penalty is. But a reprimand is a formal warning issued by the ICO indicating non-compliance with data protection laws. It's essentially a slap on the wrist for the more minor breaches. While an enforcement notice, on the other hand, is a more serious action requiring an organisation to take specific steps to rectify a significant data protection violation, often accompanied by a potential fine if not addressed.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Stuart. So before we take a real deep dive into the figures, were there any broader features of the GDPR enforcement action taken by the ICO this year that jumped out to you?
Yeah, so setting aside the action taken in relation to the PECR that you mentioned in your introduction, or the privacy and electronic communication regulations, the telemarketing rules, there were two things. First of all, of the GDPR related actions taken by the ICO in 2024, as we at URM predicted in last year's review, all of these were brought under the post-Brexit UK GDPR, introduced by the Data Protection Act 2018. So all the cases which happened under the old pre-Brexit GDPR have now been dealt with. Currently, the UK GDPR is, in practical terms, identical to the original GDPR, now known in the UK as the EU GDPR. However, this is set to change with the passing of the Data Use and Access Act, which is predicted to occur sometime in the summer of 2025. The second thing, despite the regulator's so-called public sector approach, whereby the ICO is officially reluctant to fine public sector bodies, preferring other forms of enforcement against organisations which draw from the public purse, the number of fines issued to public authorities actually went up from none in 2023 to 3 in 2024, including the two biggest fines imposed last year. Those were the £750,000 levied on the Police Service of Northern Ireland and the £350,000, reduced from an original £1 million, penalty handed out to the Ministry of Defence, as well as a £7,500 fine for the Central YMCA. The reason for the ICO diverging from its normal approach of avoiding fining public entities was probably the egregious outstandingly bad nature of the breaches in each of these cases. The YMCA infringement, for example, involved highly sensitive health data, and the MOD and PSNI breaches posed a genuine threat to people's lives. Having said that, the overall number of fines handed down in the year, 18, was almost identical to the 17 from the previous year. So slightly fewer private sector organisations were fined in 2024 compared to 2023.
So again, focusing on the GDPR, or as you pointed out, we should now call it the UK GDPR. Focusing on those cases, how did these break down to you in 2024 as compared to 2023?
So in 2023, there were a total of 30 GDPR enforcement cases brought. So actions of enforcement for breach of the GDPR. That actually went up to 32 in 2024. Now, of those 30 GDPR cases in 2023, 20 were brought against public sector bodies and 10 against organisations in the private sector, with one being a fine, the very large £12.7 million fine against TikTok in that year, 2023. And the rest of the actions being all reprimands, 29 of them, 20 of which were issued to public organisations, and 9 reprimands went to private. That was in 2023. Last year, 2024, as I mentioned, the total number of UK GDPR cases went up slightly to 32. Brought against 31 organisations, not 30. But the makeup of those organisations was markedly different from 2023. In 2023, as I mentioned, 2/3 of the organisations which received GDPR enforcement action from the regulator were public bodies. And 10 were private, so around 1/3 of the organisations acted against were private sector. In 2024, on the other hand, that proportion had fallen from 1/3 to just over 1/8. So of the 31 organisations acted against, 4 were from the private sector, and 27 were public bodies. And as mentioned, there were 3 fines amongst those 32 enforcement actions, all against public bodies, as mentioned.
And were there any developments in the ICO's use of other enforcement measures, so reprimands and enforcement notices, during this year?
Yes, so of the 32 UK GDPR cases in total, in which the ICO took enforcement action in 2024, as mentioned, only 3 resulted in a fine being imposed. The rest were all punished by issuing reprimands, 18 of these, or enforcement notices, 11. Of these 18 reprimands, down from the 29 I mentioned in 2023, however, not all were issued to public sector bodies. Only 16 of them were. So despite the Information Commissioner's rationale for not fining public authorities, that such penalties have limited deterrent effect, as it's ultimately the taxpayer who pays them, 2 recipients of reprimands were in fact private companies. Although this figure is much reduced from the 2023 one of 9 private companies receiving a reprimand. Of the 11 UK GDPR-related enforcement notices, all but 2 went to public bodies, which is an interesting development, since no such enforcement notices at all were issued to public sector entities in 2023. And those private sector organisations that received enforcement notices in 2023 did so in relation to breaches of the PECR only. This widespread use of enforcement notices in relation to non-PECR breaches is something new, and URM will be following this trend to see if it develops in 2025.
So if we turn now to the ICO's other main area of interest in data protection compliance, so infringements of the PECR, as you mentioned, how did the enforcement action taken by the regulator in 2024 compare to 2023?
Well, Annie, as in 2023, the majority of the ICO's fines were directed not at infringements of the UK GDPR, but at breaches of the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations, the PECR you refer to. However, the proportion of fines attributable to breaches of the UK GDPR rose in 2024 to 1/6 of the total, whereas in 2023 it comprised a mere 1/17. The 3 UK GDPR fines were the ones, unusually, imposed on public authorities that I've mentioned, and so these could be considered outliers. We'll have to wait and see whether the ratio of UK GDPR fines to PECR monetary penalties slips back during 2025 to the low level seen in 2023. As mentioned, the £750,000 and £350,000 monetary penalties for the PSNI, the Police Service of Northern Ireland, and the MOD for infringements of the UK GDPR were the highest issued in 2024. However, overall, the value of the 15 fines for breaches of the PECR e-marketing rules exceeded the total for UK GDPR violations, roughly £1.6 million as opposed to around £1.1 million. This was the reverse of the situation in 2023, where the sum total of GDPR fines far outstripped that for PECR. This was, again, largely the product of that enormous fine imposed on TikTok in that year, 2023.
And what was the average sort of amount of fine imposed in 2024, and how much in total did the ICO bring in fines over the year?
So the average fine in the UK in 2024 was £153,722. And that was less than a fifth of what it was in 2023. The 2023 figure was over £800,000. However, this 2023 figure was anomalous, having been heavily skewed by that £12.7 million penalty dealt out in that year to TikTok. And that was actually the third biggest fine ever issued by the ICO. The 18 fines imposed by the ICO in 2024 ranged from £7,500 to £750,000. In total, these 18 fines brought in over £2.7 million to the Treasury, down from over £13 million in 2023, which sum was again affected by the significant fine imposed on TikTok. However, this £2.7 million figure has to be considered in context. In 2024, the relatively small Irish Data Protection Commission issued €600 million in fines, about £522 million, representing half of the €1.2 billion in data protection fines imposed across the whole of the EU last year. Comparing this figure to the ICO's £2.7 million demonstrates the stark difference in approach to this question of fining between the ICO and its European counterparts. Just to take some further examples where European data protection authorities have issued single fines, which have been bigger, in some cases much bigger than the whole of the annual fine total of the ICO for 2024. In August of last year, the Dutch Data Protection Authority issued a fine of €290 million, that's about £240 million, against the ride-hailing app Uber in relation to transfers of personal data to a third country. And also in 2024, the Spanish AEPD issued 2 fines totaling €6.2 million, that's over £5 million, against a large bank for inadequate security measures. And the Italian Data Protection Authority, the Garante, fined a single utility provider €5 million, over £4 million, for using out-of-date customer data. I also thought it might be interesting to compare the total fines issued by the ICO in 2024 with the totals imposed by some other big regulators in the UK. Ofcom, which is the broadcasting and communications regulator, Ofwat, the water regulator, and the financial services regulator, the FCA, or Financial Conduct Authority. So the ICO issued, it was actually £2.767 million in fines in 2024, whereas Ofcom issued £2.8 million in fines, so very similar figure last year. But on the other hand, Ofwat issued £168 million in fines, and the FCA an even larger £176 million. So as you can see, Ofwat and the FCA issued significantly higher fines compared to the ICO. And we'll recall that Ofwat's fines were primarily due to wastewater management failures, and the FCA's fines were related to various financial misconduct issues.
So finally, many of us will have heard about the campaign the ICO has been running for the last 18 months regarding the 200 most popular, most visited websites in the UK, some of which the regulator says have deficient processes for obtaining users' consent to their use of tracking cookies for personalised, targeted marketing purposes. Were any results of this initiative reflected in the enforcement action for 2024?
Yeah, Annie, and this national cookies compliance check was actually expanded in January of 2025 to include the top 1,000 websites now in the UK. The ICO's crackdown on cookies non-compliance came too late to be reflected in 2023's fines, and has so far resulted in only one instance of enforcement action in 2024.
Sorry, was that a fine?
No, it wasn't a fine actually, but a reprimand issued to a company called Bon Terre Limited, which trades under the name Sky Betting and Gaming. And that reprimand was issued for Sky having defective procedures for gathering users' consent to advertising cookies on its website. We at URM will continue to track how the regulator's heightened vigilance on this matter develops, and whether there is any increase in the number of fines or other enforcement action for breaches of the relevant legislation during the coming year. And by the way, to learn more about how to ensure your use of cookies is compliant, listeners might like to read our blog on the URM website, Are You Getting Cookies Compliance Wrong? And as usual, the URM will continue to monitor all future ICO fines, reprimands and enforcement notices imposed in 2025. So let's see what the coming year brings.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to reading your report next year as well, Stuart.
Thank
you so much for your time today, Stuart. And for anyone that wants to read the full analysis that Stuart's written, do go to our website, urmconsulting.com, and read the analysis of fines imposed by the Information Commissioner's Office in 2024. So thank you so much for listening today, and we will see you next week. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.